So the Prime Minister of Canada just publicly accused the President of the United States of running a corruption scheme from inside the White House, and he brought the receipts. Mark Carney released a 247-page dossier this morning containing internal documents, financial records, classified communications, and testimony from a senior American official that, if verified, would constitute the largest corruption scandal in modern presidential history. And Warren Buffett, who has never in his entire career commented on a sitting president's legal or ethical controversies, just broke that rule with a statement so devastating that legal analysts are calling it the most damaging endorsement of a corruption allegation ever made by a private citizen in American history. But here's what makes this worse than the corruption itself. There was a cover-up, a coordinated, systematic effort inside the Trump administration to classify the evidence, reassign the officials who found it, and threaten the Canadian diplomats who reported it. The corruption is the scandal. The cover-up is the crisis. When you hear what's in that dossier, who's involved, what they tried to hide, and what Buffett says this means for the future of the American presidency, you'll understand why this isn't just another scandal. This is the one that might not go away. Subscribe now, because this story is about to explode. Let me walk you through exactly how this unfolded, because the story of how Carney found this corruption is almost as extraordinary as the corruption itself. It started during routine U.S.-Canada trade negotiations, the kind of grinding, technical, deeply boring diplomatic work that happens continuously between the two countries. Canadian trade officials on the negotiating team began noticing irregularities in the American positions. Certain demands didn't make economic sense. Companies that should have been fighting aggressively for tariff relief were conspicuously quiet, as if they'd already been taken care of through some other channel. Meanwhile, other companies that had no obvious stake in the specific tariff categories being discussed were suddenly lobbying furiously for exemptions, showing up in meetings they had no reason to attend, making arguments that didn't align with their actual business interests. The patterns didn't add up. Canadian trade analysts are trained to spot economic illogic and negotiation positions. It's how you detect when the other side is bluffing or hiding something. And what they were seeing across the table from their American counterparts was deeply illogical, unless there was a second set of motivations operating behind the official position. That's when Canadian intelligence got involved. CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, was already conducting routine monitoring of communications surrounding the trade negotiations, which is standard practice between allied nations during significant economic negotiations. It's not spying in the adversarial sense. It's the intelligence equivalent of due diligence. And during that monitoring, CSIS analysts picked up references to what internal communications called a parallel process, a second track of negotiations happening entirely outside official channels. This parallel track involved Trump-connected intermediaries meeting privately with companies seeking tariff exemptions outside the formal negotiation framework, outside congressional oversight, and outside the view of the career civil servants who were supposed to be managing the trade relationship. This is the moment it went from a trade anomaly to an intelligence matter. Over the next several months, CSIS and the Canadian Foreign Ministry assembled what would become the Dossier, 247 pages of documents, financial records, corporate filings, internal communications obtained through intelligence channels and through one extraordinary source, a senior American trade official who had been watching the corruption unfold from the inside and could no longer stay silent. This person, whose identity remains protected under Canadian intelligence protocols, quietly provided corroborating documents to their Canadian counterparts during a diplomatic exchange in Ottawa. This wasn't a leak motivated by politics or personal grievance. This was a career civil servant, someone who had spent decades in public service, who watched corruption happen in real time inside their own government and decided that their oath to the Constitution of the United States mattered more than their loyalty to any administration. The completed dossier was reviewed by Canadian legal experts, vetted by CSIS leadership, and crucially shared in advance with key Commonwealth intelligence partners in the United Kingdom and Australia for independent verification. Both confirmed the documentary evidence was authentic. Carney's first instinct was to handle it quietly. He followed diplomatic protocol to the letter. He notified the White House through the Canadian ambassador that irregularities had been detected in the trade negotiations and requested a private discussion to resolve the matter. The response from the Trump administration was immediate, decisive, and deeply incriminating. They didn't investigate, they didn't ask questions, they didn't request more details, they covered it up. Communications related to the back-channel negotiations were retroactively classified as national security sensitive. Two senior American trade officials who had internally raised concerns about the parallel track were reassigned to unrelated positions within weeks of Carney's notification. Canadian embassy staff who had reported the irregularities through proper channels received what Carney later described as unmistakable signals that further inquiry would have consequences for the broader bilateral relationship. And then, in what legal analysts are calling the most legally reckless move of the entire cover-up, the Trump administration requested that the Canadian government sign non-disclosure agreements covering all informal communications related to the trade negotiations. The cover-up began the moment Carney tried to handle it quietly, and that's when he made his decision. This couldn't be resolved through private channels. The private channels had been used to bury it. The world needed to see this. Carney released the dossier simultaneously to the Washington Post, the Financial Times, the BBC, and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Then he walked to the podium. Now, let me take you through what's actually in the dossier, because the specifics are more damning than any summary can convey. The centerpiece of the corruption scheme is what investigators are calling the Tariff exemption kickback pipeline. Here's how it worked. Companies seeking exemptions from the steel and aluminum tariffs, exemptions that are entirely legitimate under the tariff framework and are supposed to be granted based on economic merit through a transparent application process, were being quietly directed through unofficial channels to a network of Trump-connected consulting firms. These firms, several of which were established in the months immediately following the tariff announcements, charged advisory fees ranging from 2 to 5% of the projected tariff savings. A company expecting to save $100 million in tariffs would pay a $2 to $5 million advisory fee to a consulting firm whose only qualification was its proximity to the president's inner circle. The fees were funneled through a network of shell companies registered in Delaware and Wyoming, states whose corporate privacy laws make it exceptionally difficult to trace beneficial ownership. But Canadian forensic accountants working from financial records obtained through intelligence channels and corroborated by the American Whistleblower traced the money flows from the companies seeking exemptions through the shell entities through the consulting firms and ultimately to entities connected to Trump family members and major political donors. One specific case laid out in the dossier is devastating in its clarity. A mid-sized American manufacturing company paid a $4.7 million advisory fee to one of the connected consulting firms. Within 3 weeks, the company received a tariff exemption worth approximately $180 million in projected savings over the life of the tariff period. That's not consulting. That's a toll booth. You want access to your own government's exemption process, you pay the fee, and the fee flows into the pockets of the president's personal network. The dossier identifies at least 14 companies that follow this same path. Pay the fee, get the exemption, and never mention it to anyone. But the kickback scheme was only the first layer. While the public trade negotiations between the U.S. and Canada were deadlocked, while Carney and Trump's trade representatives were publicly arguing over tariff rates and market access, a secret parallel negotiation was underway. Trump-affiliated intermediaries were negotiating preferential access to Canadian critical minerals for a consortium of companies with direct and traceable ties to the Trump Organization, lithium, nickel, cobalt, the exact resources that the entire global economy is racing to secure for the transition to electric vehicles and advanced electronics. The consortium would pay 30 to 40% below prevailing commodity market rates, a discount worth hundreds of millions of dollars over the life of the arrangement, and the profits would flow through a chain of limited liability companies that Canadian investigators painstakingly traced back to entities controlled by Trump family members. The President of the United States was using trade negotiations that affect the livelihoods of millions of Americans and Canadians as cover to secure personal business deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The tariffs weren't just bad policy. They were a distraction, a smoke screen. The chaos of the trade war provided cover for the real transaction happening in the shadows. And then there's the diplomatic extortion. The dossier contains evidence, internal communications, timestamp memoranda, email chains with metadata showing that Trump personally directed diplomatic pressure on Canadian officials to fast-track permits for a Trump-branded luxury development project near Toronto. American trade representatives were instructed to imply, not state directly, but imply through carefully constructed language that the broader trade negotiations would be less productive if the Canadian regulatory timeline for the development project experienced delays. One internal communication from a senior Trump advisor reproduced in full in the dossier reads, "Make sure Ottawa understands the connection between their regulatory timeline and our flexibility at the table." That sentence is a smoking gun in 11 words. That's not diplomacy. That's extortion. It's using the economic relationship between two sovereign nations, a relationship that affects the jobs, prices, and prosperity of hundreds of millions of people as leverage for a real estate deal. Canadian officials who received this pressure documented everything. Timestamp memos filed the same day, recorded phone calls, legal under Canadian federal law, email chains preserved in triplicate on secure government servers, and then the cover-up. When Carney's government tried to address the irregularities through proper diplomatic channels, the Trump administration didn't investigate. It didn't ask for more information. It didn't express concern or promise accountability. It had 4 steps, each more legally perilous than the last. Step 1, classify. Communications related to the back-channel negotiations were retroactively reclassified as national security sensitive material, which removed them from the reach of congressional oversight committees and shielded them from Freedom of Information Act requests. The Classification Authority of the United States government, a system designed to protect genuine national security secrets, was weaponized to hide evidence of presidential corruption. Step 2, reassign. 2 senior career trade officials who had internally raised concerns about the parallel track were removed from their positions and reassigned to unrelated departments within weeks. Neither was given an explanation. Neither was accused of wrongdoing. They were simply moved quietly, efficiently, and with unmistakable intent. Step 3, threaten. Canadian embassy staff who had reported the irregularities through proper diplomatic channels received signals conveyed through intermediaries and through shifts in diplomatic tone that experienced diplomats recognized immediately that further inquiry would have negative consequences for the broader bilateral relationship. Step 4, silence. The Trump administration formally requested that the Canadian government sign non-disclosure agreements covering all informal communications related to the trade negotiations, an NDA between 2 sovereign governments to cover up corruption. Legal analysts are calling this the single most incriminating element of the entire cover-up because the NDA request has no legitimate diplomatic purpose. You don't ask a foreign government to sign a non-disclosure agreement unless you're trying to prevent something specific from being disclosed. Classify, reassign, threaten, silence. That's not damage control. That's not crisis management. That's obstruction. That is a president using the classification authority, the personnel power, and the diplomatic machinery of the most powerful government on earth to hide evidence of his own corruption. And then Warren Buffett made the statement that turned a foreign policy scandal into a domestic reckoning. In 70 years of public life, Warren Buffett has maintained one absolute rule. He does not comment on presidential legal matters. Not Watergate, when he was already one of the most prominent investors in America. Not Iran-Contra. Not the Clinton impeachment. Not either of Trump's first or second impeachments. Not any of the criminal indictments. In every case, through every administration, through every scandal that consumed Washington and dominated every cable news cycle, Buffett stayed silent. He considered it outside his role as an investor and business leader. He believed fundamentally that the institutions of American governance, the courts, the Congress, the Department of Justice, would ultimately self-correct, that the system had built in mechanisms for accountability, and that his job was to invest in that system, not to adjudicate its failures. But today, the 9-4-year-old investor broke that 7-0-year rule. And the fact that he broke it, the sheer historic weight of what it means that Warren Buffett decided this specific scandal was the one he could no longer stay silent about, tells you more about the severity of this dossier than any legal analysis or congressional hearing ever could. I've spent my career studying businesses, Buffett said, how they're run, how they succeed, and how they fail. The pattern described in the Canadian dossier is one I've seen 100 times in the private sector. When leadership enriches itself at the expense of the organization it was entrusted to serve, the organization eventually collapses. It doesn't matter how big the organization is. It doesn't matter how strong it appears from the outside. Once the leadership is looting the treasury, collapse is a matter of time. The only difference here is that the organization is the United States government. He continued, the cover-up concerns me more than the corruption itself. Corruption can be prosecuted. Corruption can be punished. Individual corrupt actors can be identified and removed. But when a government actively uses its classification authority, its personnel power, and its diplomatic leverage to hide evidence of wrongdoing from its own citizens and its own Congress, you're no longer dealing with a corrupt individual. You're dealing with a corrupt system. And corrupt systems, in my experience, don't reform themselves. They have to be reformed from the outside. And then the third quote, the one that landed with the force of a judicial verdict and was read aloud on the floor of the Senate within hours. Trust is the foundation of every institution, every company, every government, every alliance. What this dossier describes is the systematic destruction of that trust for personal profit. And once trust is destroyed, the institution follows. I have watched it happen to companies I've invested in. I have watched it happen to industries. I pray it does not happen to this country. But I will not pretend the danger isn't real. Warren Buffett just compared the Trump administration to a failing company where management is looting the treasury while assuring shareholders everything is fine. And he said the cover-up proves this isn't one bad actor making poor decisions in isolation. It's a corrupt system, a captured institution where the machinery of government has been deliberately turned into an instrument of personal enrichment. Consider what it means coming from this specific person. Buffett has spent his entire career building Berkshire Hathaway on the principles of absolute transparency, ethical governance, and ruthless integrity. He has fired executives for far less than what's described in this dossier. He famously told his managers, lose money for the firm and I will be understanding. Lose a shred of reputation for the firm and I will be ruthless. That standard that the integrity of the institution matters more than any individual profit is the standard he's now applying to the United States government. And by that standard, the government is failing catastrophically. In Buffett's world, the response to discovering fraud is immediate and non-negotiable. Investigate the scope, disclose the findings to stakeholders, and remove the people responsible. The Trump administration's response to the exact same discovery was the mirror opposite. Classify the evidence, reassign the people who found it, and silence the people who reported it. Investigate, disclose, remove versus classify, reassign, silence. Buffett has watched this second pattern play out in the corporate world dozens of times, and he knows exactly how it ends. It ends with collapse, with prosecution, and with everyone who participated wishing they'd spoken up sooner. And here's the detail that shows Buffett isn't merely commenting. He's acting on his own analysis. Berkshire Hathaway's compliance team has already begun a comprehensive review of every government contract held by every Berkshire subsidiary to ensure that none of them were granted through the tainted exemption process described in the Dossier. Berkshire holds government contracts worth billions across its subsidiaries. BNSF Railway, Berkshire Hathaway Energy, Precision Cast Parts, dozens of manufacturing and infrastructure companies. Buffett is treating the United States government as a counterparty that can no longer be trusted to operate honestly when the most respected businessman in American history decides he needs to audit his own company's relationship with the federal government because he can't trust the government to be clean. That's not a political statement. That's a corporate governance emergency. That's a five-alarm institutional fire. And Buffett's most important point, the one that elevates this from a scandal to a systemic crisis, is about scope. If the exemption scheme involved at least 14 companies, multiple Trump-connected intermediary firms, a network of shell entities across multiple states, a secret resource deal, diplomatic extortion, and a coordinated four-step cover-up across multiple government departments, then you're not looking at one person's corruption, You're looking at an institution that has been captured. One person is a scandal. A system is a captured institution. And captured institutions don't reform themselves. You can survive a scandal. Buffett said, you cannot survive an institution that has been turned into an instrument of personal enrichment, not indefinitely. The math doesn't allow it. The fallout from the Dossier's release has been cascading and accelerating by the hour. In Congress, the reaction split along predictable lines, but with critical fractures. Democrats immediately called for a special counsel, subpoenas for every official named in the dossier, and a formal impeachment inquiry. But the more telling reaction came from the Republican side. Several senators who've been reliably loyal to Trump through every previous controversy publicly called for a full and transparent investigation into the allegations. That language matters. They didn't say witch hunt. They didn't say foreign interference. They said full and transparent investigation. Watch the language. When allies switch from witch hunt to we need to get to the bottom of this, the ground is shifting beneath the president's feet. The Senate Intelligence Committee announced a classified briefing to review the dossier within the week. The cooperating witnesses are multiplying. The senior American official who provided documents to Canada was not alone in their concerns. They were simply the first to act. Within 48 hours of the dossier's release, 2 additional American officials retained attorneys and signaled their willingness to cooperate with investigators. One of the reassigned trade officials, one of the people who was punished for raising concerns internally, filed a formal whistleblower complaint with the Inspector General, alleging retaliation and obstruction. The cover-up created its own enemies. Every person who was reassigned, every person who was threatened, every person who was silenced is now a potential cooperating witness. And they're angry. They're angry because they tried to do the right thing through proper channels, and they were punished for it. Now the proper channels have failed. The evidence is public, and they have nothing left to lose. The instruments of the cover-up are becoming the evidence of the cover-up. The 14 companies identified in the dossier's exemption kickback scheme are in full crisis mode. Stock prices falling, legal teams mobilized, board members demanding emergency meetings. Banks that facilitated the shell company transactions are conducting internal reviews to assess their own legal exposure on K Street, Washington's lobbying corridor. The mood is described as controlled panic. Every lobbyist who touched tariff policy in the last 2 years is calling their attorney. Every company that received a tariff exemption is now wondering whether their exemption was granted on merit or whether it passed through the corruption pipeline without their knowledge. Internationally, the reaction has been seismic. The European Union, Japan, and South Korea have all formally requested access to the dossier through diplomatic channels because the obvious question is now unavoidable. If this corruption scheme existed in U.S.-Canada trade negotiations, did it also operate in U.S.-EU trade, in U.S.-Japan trade, in U.S.-Korea trade? Every American trading partner is now asking, were we also being played? Were there parallel tracks in our negotiations too? Five Eyes intelligence partners are conducting their own reviews, and Mark Carney's stature has transformed overnight. He could have been accused of foreign interference. He could have been dismissed as a political opportunist trying to embarrass a rival. Instead, because the evidence was so overwhelming and so meticulously documented, the narrative became something far more powerful. Carney did what American institutions failed to do. The Prime Minister of Canada is doing the job that American prosecutors, American congressional oversight committees, and American intelligence agencies should have been doing all along. He exposed corruption that the people paid to prevent corruption somehow missed entirely. Think about that for a moment. Canada's intelligence service found what the FBI, the DOJ, and the United States Congress all failed to detect. That's not a compliment to Canada. That's an indictment of every American institution tasked with preventing exactly this. So let's talk about what this means at the scale of the Constitution and the future of American governance, because the stakes here go far beyond one dossier, one president, or one corruption scheme. What the dossier describes isn't a single act of corruption. It's not an isolated lapse in judgment. It's a comprehensive abuse of presidential power across 4 distinct domains, each of which independently represents a serious violation of the public trust and which together represents something that constitutional scholars are struggling to find a historical parallel for. using tariff policy as a personal enrichment vehicle, directing companies to pay fees to your personal network in exchange for government-granted exemptions, that's abuse of executive economic authority. It transforms a policy tool meant to serve the national interest into a toll booth that serves one family's financial interests, using classification powers to retroactively hide evidence of that corruption from Congress and the public. That's not just an abuse of the national security apparatus. It's the weaponization of the secrecy infrastructure that was built to protect the country against foreign threats turned inward to protect a president against accountability, using personnel reassignment to punish career civil servants who tried to report irregularities through proper channels. That's obstruction of legitimate oversight and retaliation against protected whistleblower activity, and using diplomatic channels to pressure a foreign government into fast-tracking permits for a private business venture. That's corruption of foreign policy itself. It's using the weight of the United States of America, its economic power, its diplomatic leverage as a personal business tool. Any one of these would be a serious scandal-warranting investigation and potential prosecution. Together, they describe something much darker, a presidency that has been converted from a public trust into a private enterprise, the office that was designed by the founders to serve the American people, the office that carries the weight of the Constitution, the armed forces, the Treasury, and the diplomatic authority of the most powerful nation on earth was being used to serve the financial interests of one family and their network of consultants, shell companies, and political donors. And the institutional failure is perhaps the most disturbing element of all, because it raises questions that go far beyond any individual president. Why didn't American institutions catch this first? This is the question that should haunt every American, regardless of their political alignment. The Inspector General system was created for exactly this purpose, to detect and investigate waste, fraud, and abuse within the executive branch. Congressional oversight committees have subpoena power and dedicated staff specifically to monitor executive branch conduct. The Department of Justice has entire divisions, the Public Integrity Section, the FBI's public corruption units dedicated to investigating exactly this type of misconduct. These institutions exist. They're funded. They're staffed with career professionals. And yet, a corruption scheme involving at least 14 companies, millions of dollars in kickback fees routed through shell entities in multiple states, a secret mineral extraction deal worth hundreds of millions, diplomatic extortion documented in real time, and a 4-step cover-up operation coordinated across multiple government departments, all of it went undetected by every single American watchdog institution supposedly responsible for preventing it, a foreign intelligence service founded, Canada founded. That fact alone should terrify every American citizen, regardless of whether they voted for Trump, against Trump, or didn't vote at all. Because the failure here isn't partisan, it's structural. If the system can't catch corruption, this blatant, this extensively documented, this operationally reckless, then either the system is broken or the system has been captured. And Warren Buffett, the man who has spent 70 years studying exactly how institutions fail, already told us which one he believes. If this goes unpunished, the precedent it sets is devastating for every future administration. Every future president will know you can use trade policy for personal enrichment. You can hide the evidence using the classification authority that was entrusted to you to protect national security. You can sideline internal dissent through quiet reassignments and subtle intimidation. You can pressure foreign governments to sign non-disclosure agreements designed not to protect diplomacy, but to conceal misconduct. And if it takes a foreign leader to expose what your own oversight institutions fail to uncover, then the failure runs deeper than any single scandal. That is the precedent. That is what impunity looks like when it reaches the highest office of the most powerful government on earth. But if it is confronted, if investigations proceed without fear or favor, if the evidence is followed wherever it leads, if accountability is pursued regardless of political cost, then something essential endures. The system may work slowly, it may work imperfectly, it may even require uncomfortable outside pressure to activate. But if it works at all, it preserves the principle that no office, no individual stands above the law. The real cost of corruption is rarely paid by those who design it. It is paid by the career civil servants who raise concerns and work quietly